Charleston, South Carolina, summer of 2022. The heat clings to the shutters of the old colonial house like memory to old wood. Anna, 27, a librarian with a quiet soul and an eye for forgotten things, is standing in the kitchen of her late grandmother, Evelyn. It's the first time she's been here alone since the funeral. Silence is thick, not heavy, but sacred. Boxes are stacked in corners. Dozens of them, labeled in fading pen, photos, letters, cookbooks. Evelyn was an excellent cook. Her pecan pie had won ribbons at the county fair more than once. Everyone thought that was her legacy. Flour, sugar, cinnamon. But tucked inside one of the oldest binders, under a recipe for cornbread and another for tomato preserve, Anna finds something unexpected. A folded piece of parchment, yellowed and delicate. Handwriting, not Evelyn's, and in English but unfamiliar in tone. Hope to see you tomorrow. Same place near the lake. J. Anna pauses. The handwriting is masculine, the ink slightly smudged, and the date, scribbled faintly in the corner, June 1944. She sets it aside carefully and begins flipping through the book. More notes fall out, some in envelopes, others folded between recipes for wartime ration dishes. They're short, heartfelt, and intimate. Your biscuits reminded me of home. The sky's loud again tonight. All I want is to hear your voice. I dreamt of you yesterday, and it didn't feel like war. Always signed the same way. J. Anna is no stranger to history, but this isn't history. This is personal. This is bloodline and breath. She calls her mother, asks gently if she ever heard stories about a man during the war. Her mother hesitates, then admits she once overheard Evelyn humming a song from the 40s, something about waiting for someone who never returned, but she'd always dismissed it as sentimentality. Evelyn never spoke of it. Over the next few days, Anna becomes obsessed. She begins organizing the notes, arranging them by date, mapping locations hinted at in the letters. She learns that during the summer of 1944, Charleston had military outposts, training facilities, and ferry stations. It's plausible that Evelyn, then 19 and still living with her parents near the Ashley River, might have crossed paths with a soldier preparing for deployment to Europe. But who was Jay? And why did he leave behind these letters hidden in between recipes for molasses cookies and sweet potato pie? Something tells Anna this wasn't just a flirtation. This was a love stitched quietly into the fabric of a war-torn time. A love Evelyn carried in silence for the rest of her life. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. The first note wasn't tucked away like a secret. It was just resting there, as if waiting. Folded neatly between a recipe for wartime sugarless apple pie and one for collard greens, the paper was delicate, with corners worn smooth by time. Anna unfolded it carefully, holding her breath, as if the ink might disappear with the wrong exhale. Hope to see you tomorrow. Same place near the lake. J. It was brief, just a handful of words. But they didn't belong there, not among cornstarch and vinegar measurements. This wasn't a shopping list or a handwritten substitution tip for powdered milk. It was a message, and it pulsed with something that didn't fade with time: longing. Anna's fingers trembled slightly as she set the note on the table. Her eyes scanned the recipe book, a heavy binder filled with her grandmother's neat handwriting, yellowed pages, grease stains from decades ago. She turned another page. A second note slid free, this one written on the back of a military meal ration card. The moon was bright last night. I imagined it lighting your kitchen window. Anna's heart caught in her throat. She wasn't reading history. She was stepping into a life her grandmother had never spoken of. More notes followed, hidden between clippings of Victory Garden pamphlets and magazine pages suggesting how to stretch one egg into a meal for 4. Some were hastily written, others deliberate and poetic. Your voice is what I carry into sleep. They say we ship out soon. I think of your hands, I keep your smile in my pocket like a compass, always signed with the same simple letter. Anna didn't know what to think. Her grandmother had lived a full life, married, raised 2 children, loved gardening, church picnics, and humming Patsy Cline songs while baking. There was no trace in her later years of sorrow or regret. And yet, here, in her own handwriting and in someone else's, was a quiet, pulsing romance, buried, folded, stored away like flour during rationing, hidden but always present. Anna sat at the kitchen table and began organizing the notes chronologically. Some had dates, others gave clues, references to weather, the phases of the moon, a town parade. She cross-referenced them with historical records. Charleston in 1944 was alive with military movement, naval officers, engineers, transport troops. Many were stationed temporarily before being sent overseas. If James, she was now sure that was his name, had been among them, he might have spent a few weeks or months in the area, long enough to fall in love, but not long enough to stay. She found one note that shifted the air in the room. If I come back, I'll ask you the question I couldn't today. Wait for me. It was folded inside a recipe for sweet potato casserole. Anna had to stand. She walked into the living room, looked out through the sunlit windows her grandmother had once cleaned with vinegar and newspapers. Had Evelyn stood here holding a letter close to her chest, watching the road for a figure who never returned? She called her mother again, pressed harder this time, and her mother, quiet for a long moment, finally said, "There was someone. Mom never told me much. Just that there was a boy before Dad. A soldier. She said he made her feel safe when nothing in the world was." Clues continued to emerge. A faded photograph tucked inside a Bible, a piece of ribbon embroidered with the letter J, a slip of paper with what looked like a street address in St. Louis. Anna began to sense the shape of something larger than romance. This was resilience, a secret thread of hope her grandmother had carried silently through marriage, motherhood, and decades of ordinary life. James wasn't just a chapter that closed. He was folded into every pie crust, every song hummed, every glance toward the porch swing when no one was there. The final note she found was hidden in a pocket sewn into the back cover of a 1943 Charleston ladies' cookbook. The paper was thinner, the ink faded, but the words were enough to still the room. If you're reading this, then I made it. Somehow, somewhere. I'll keep writing even if the words never reach you. Because love, once spoken, doesn't need to be heard. It just is. Anna pressed her hand over her heart. Her grandmother had never spoken of this love, but she had lived it, carried it, preserved it between layers of butter and flour and wartime memories. And now, nearly 80 years later, someone had finally found it. Long after the sun had slipped behind the oak trees outside and the cicadas began their slow, humming chorus, Anna sat in her grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by a sea of yellowed paper, ribbons, old books, and silence. But it was no longer an empty silence. It was full of breath, of voices long gone, of moments that refused to be erased. She wasn't simply reading now, she was remembering for someone who could no longer speak. Evelyn had been 19 in the summer of 1944. She still lived with her parents in a modest clapboard house on the banks of the Ashley River. Her father worked part-time repairing boats, her mother volunteered at the church and baked to fill the pantry shelves. Their world was small, stretched headlines of fallen soldiers and the fear that each week might bring bad news. And then James appeared. According to a neighbor's letter Anna found tucked in the back of a recipe file, James had come to Charleston as part of a short-term naval logistics unit stationed near the harbor. He was from Missouri and had a quiet drawl, wide shoulders, and a gaze that lingered kindly. No one knew how he and Evelyn had first met. Maybe at the church picnic, maybe when she delivered bread to the barracks, maybe simply by chance. But whatever sparked between them bloomed quickly. They had little time and even fewer words. Evelyn spoke softly, and James didn't say much unless it mattered. But he showed up day after day, walking the dirt path behind the house to sit with her near the water, where she would bring peach biscuits and he would read her parts of his favorite books, struggling through the accent, but smiling when she laughed. They exchanged notes more than they spoke, written on napkins, old recipe cards, ration slips. She would tuck them inside cookbooks, safe, hidden in plain sight. He would leave his behind the loose plank on the porch, beneath a flower pot, between the pages of her hymnal. "I don't know what your voice means," he wrote once, "but I want to learn it. You make this war feel like a pause in something beautiful. In a war defined by absence, they gave each other presents." Anna imagined Evelyn walking barefoot down the dock in the early morning, dress clinging to her knees, wind tugging at her hair. James waiting, a thermos in hand, eyes tired from drills, but soft when they met hers. She saw Evelyn wrapping his hand with a cloth after a small cut, and the way he'd kissed her forehead like he was saying goodbye before he even had to. The day he left was never marked with clarity. Anna found no date, just a final note. Orders came. "I leave tomorrow. I didn't want to write this, but I couldn't walk away without telling you. You're the only thing I've been sure of in months." There was no reply. Anna's mother told her Evelyn never mentioned him by name. Just once, years ago, during a hurricane when the power had gone out, Evelyn had lit a candle and said, "The last time I felt wind like this, he was with me." Anna began to understand that Evelyn hadn't forgotten. She'd just folded James into her life, quietly, reverently, like a secret ingredient only she could taste. In one journal entry written decades later, Anna found a single sentence. "I loved a boy who held my hand like it was a promise." There was no signature, no explanation, but Anna knew who it was about. What Evelyn and James had was fleeting, not because it lacked strength, but because time denied them the chance to stay. And yet somehow the memory had endured longer than the war itself. It had survived in notes, in whispers, in the spaces between recipes and the curve of a letter's final loop. James had promised to write. Whether he did, whether his letters were lost, intercepted, never sent, Anna couldn't be sure. But she knew, deep down, that he had meant it, that he had wanted a future, and that Evelyn, in her own way, had kept it alive. Maybe that was what love meant in times like those. Not a marriage certificate, not photos in silver frames, not a happily ever after, but a quiet bond that survived on memory alone. There were things Anna knew for certain about her grandmother Evelyn, that she never left the house without lipstick, that she made the best blackberry jam in the county, that she loved crossword puzzles but never did them in ink. But now, in the wake of these letters, Anna realized how much she didn't know. Not out of neglect, but because Evelyn had chosen silence. And in that silence, there had always been a story waiting to be found. Anna returned to the boxes. Not just the recipe binders, but the tins of keepsakes, the wrapped bundles of old linens, the photo albums with faces she never learned the names of. And in a drawer tucked into a sewing cabinet, hidden beneath a stack of pressed handkerchiefs, she found something that stopped her heart. A medal, small, circular, made of bronze. The inscription read, "For service, United States Army." And with it, carefully wrapped in lace, was a folded photograph. James, in uniform. Eyes the same quiet shade of kindness Anna had imagined. He stood beside a truck, hat in hand, smile restrained, not posed but present. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, Evelyn had written, "The day before he left." It was the first time Anna saw his name in her grandmother's handwriting. She sat there, surrounded by thread spools and old buttons, and felt something press against her chest. Not sadness exactly, but reverence. This had been Evelyn's shrine, her private corner of memory, a love never forgotten, but also never spoken aloud. Why? That question haunted Anna as she pieced more together. She asked her mother again, about Evelyn's early years, about whether anyone else knew. Her mother only shrugged. She mentioned him once, said there was a boy who asked about her biscuits more than he asked about the war. I thought it was just a story. But it wasn't. It was the truth wrapped in flour and handwritten in the margins of a recipe card. Anna started to see Evelyn not just as a grandmother but as a woman. A young girl who once gave her heart away to a boy who may have promised to return but never did. And who, instead of hardening, had quietly carried that memory through decades of domestic life, into motherhood, widowhood, every Christmas pie and Sunday hymn. Evelyn hadn't erased James. She had woven him into the background. His love had become her silence. One evening, Anna found herself at the kitchen table, Evelyn's favorite apron folded in her lap, reading one of the last notes James had written. "If this war ends and we're still standing, I'll make sure you never eat dinner alone again." Anna realized something. Evelyn had spent decades cooking for others, feeding neighbors, welcoming churchgoers, always filling the room with warmth. Maybe that was how she kept his promise alive. Maybe every plate she set, every table she dressed, was her way of answering James, of making sure someone, somewhere, never ate alone. And now, Anna was the one sitting at the same table, the one Evelyn had once filled with quiet joy. She ran her fingers over the wood, imagined the years pressed into its grain, and whispered, "I hear you now." She didn't know if Evelyn had wanted this story to be uncovered. Maybe she had feared what people might think. Maybe she had protected James's memory because it was the only thing left that was truly hers. Or maybe she had hoped that one day someone would find the notes, the photograph, the medal, and know that love had once bloomed despite war. Know that promises made under falling stars don't disappear. Know that even silence is a form of speaking. Anna closed the drawer, folded the apron, and stood up. The silence was still there, but now it was peaceful. It was whole. It began with a name and a city, James W. and St. Louis. That's all Anna had. But in a world where so much could be found with just a thread and enough determination, it was a start. She wrote emails, filled out forms, reached out to veterans' archives, historical societies, local libraries. She didn't even know what she was hoping for, just that she needed to know what happened to him, for Evelyn, for herself. Weeks passed, and then one morning an envelope arrived. No return address, just her own handwriting in the top left corner. Inside were photocopied documents, military discharge papers, a newspaper clipping, a church bulletin, and, folded inside a plain white sheet, a photograph. James, older now, grey at the temples, standing in front of a small-town schoolhouse, holding a book. His smile softer, quieter, but still carrying that same look, like he was holding onto something only he could see. The letter that came with it was brief. James W. had returned to Missouri after the war. He had become a teacher, never married, no known children. Died in 1989. The funeral had been modest. A few colleagues, former students, a pastor who described him as gentle, thoughtful, and deeply private. Among his belongings was a box labeled Berlin. Inside were books in German, a pressed flower, and a bundle of folded notes. Some written in his hand, others in Evelyn's. Anna's breath caught. He had kept them. Every note, every word. All the way until the end. One note, transcribed in the archive's records, read, "She made the war feel less cruel. Her laugh stayed with me longer than the sound of gunfire ever did." Another simply said, "I wrote. Maybe she never got it. Maybe she moved on. But I still set a second cup at the table some nights." Anna's tears came slowly, quietly, the kind that don't announce themselves, but rise like a tide that knows exactly when to return. She wasn't grieving James. Not really. She was grieving the years, the silence, the weight her grandmother had carried alone. James had not forgotten. He hadn't disappeared. He He had returned, tried to write, and, for reasons they would never fully know, those words never reached Evelyn. Letters lost in transit, caught in censors' hands, misdelivered, buried under the weight of a world trying to rebuild itself. But the love had survived anyway. Anna wrote back to the archive. She sent copies of Evelyn's recipes, scans of the notes, a photograph of Evelyn as a young woman, her hair tied back, her eyes bright. She asked them to place it with James's belongings, to unite, even symbolically, what life had not allowed. Then she sat down and wrote a final letter. Not to the archives, but to James. She told him that Evelyn had remembered, that she had kept every note, that she had lived a full life, but never stopped looking out the window a little longer some evenings, that she had baked, hummed, waited, that he had been loved not just in 1944, but for all the years after, in silence and sweetness and memory. When she sealed the letter, Anna placed it in Evelyn's old recipe box between peach cobbler and chicken pot pie. It belonged there, not in a museum, but in the home where it had begun. She looked around the kitchen. It was the same, but it wasn't. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of voices, laughter, wind through lace curtains, of a girl and a soldier who once believed that a single kiss might be enough to outlast the world's noise. And somehow, it had been. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in quiet moments, when Anna stood in the kitchen kneading dough, when she set 2 plates at the table without thinking, when she opened a window and caught the scent of peaches on a warm breeze. Evelyn was there. James too. Not as ghosts, but as something gentler, present in the details, in the pauses. Anna knew she couldn't keep this story to herself. It was too fragile, too important, and too beautiful to fade away again. So she began to write, not just about the notes, but about the recipes too. Because Evelyn had never separated them. She had folded love and food into the same pages, had pressed memory into the dough, had sweetened the silence with cinnamon and thyme. Anna's book was small. She self-published it under the title, What the War Left Behind. It featured Evelyn's handwritten recipes, unchanged, ink-smudged, measurements sometimes vague, and between them, the notes from James. She didn't explain them. She let them speak for themselves. Readers responded not with fanfare, but with letters. Letters from granddaughters who had found old photographs, from sons who remembered their mothers crying at the sound of a certain song, from people who had never talked about what the war had taken, or quietly what it had left behind. The book lived not on bestseller lists, but in kitchens, on countertops stained with berry juice, next to coffee mugs, inside cabinets that still held their grandmother's salt shakers. It was exactly where it belonged. And in the very last page, printed in Evelyn's original handwriting, was James's favorite recipe, one she had tucked away with his final note, peach cobbler with nutmeg crust. Below it, Anna added only one sentence, for the ones who loved bravely, even without a promise. She closed the book and placed a copy on Evelyn's shelf. Then she sat by the window, sipping tea, listening to the wind move through the trees. She wasn't waiting, she was remembering, and in that remembering, they were never truly gone. We share real stories every day, stories that move, inspire, and stay with you.